Welcome to Inside Politics. I'm Phil Mattingly. John King is off. President Trump is on his way to New Orleans this hour to speak at a farmers' convention. That's New Orleans as in Louisiana, not Nashville as in Tennessee, like he tweeted this morning. But on the White House lawn, the president fielded questions not on the plight of farmers, but on whether or not he's working for the Russians. And the college football national champion Clemson Tigers will greet the president when he's back in the White House later tonight. So naturally, he previewed the menu.
And I think we're going to serve McDonald's, Wendy's, and Burger King's with some pizza. I really mean it. It'll be interesting, and I would think that's their favorite food.
Paging Clemson strength and conditioning coach Joey Batson may have some issues with that. Now, the president's attorney general nominee is laying down a big and important marker. Two of them, actually. One, the Russia special counsel should finish his investigation. Number two, that the American public should see Robert Mueller's report. More on that in a few minutes. But we begin with a straight-up denial from the president that to a now burning question brought on by new reporting. Mr. President, did you do the Kremlin's bidding inside the Oval Office?
I never worked for Russia, and you know that answer better than anybody. I never worked for Russia. Not only did I never work for Russia, I think it's a disgrace that you even asked that question, because it's a whole big fat hoax.
That question, surreal as it is, being asked this morning because of a weekend flurry of revelations. The biggest being this, that the FBI decided in May 2017 to investigate the president and whether he was secretly acting at the behest of Russia. Today, new details on how and why the FBI made that extraordinary decision. CNN obtained transcripts of closed-door congressional interviews with top FBI officials. The documents reveal a half-dozen senior FBI lawyers and agents debated whether to open the investigation into the president. The chief concern raised by the president's dismissal of FBI Director James Comey, that he did it at the direction of the Kremlin. That was one extreme, the FBI's then top lawyer James Baker told congressional investigators last year. The other extreme is that the president is completely innocent. We discussed that too. Asked then by lawmakers if the FBI determined the president was working wittingly or unwittingly for Russia, Baker said, "I don't know." CNN's Caitlin Collins is in New Orleans, where the president will speak to a farmers' convention later this hour. And Caitlin, I'm sure you freaked out a little bit when he said he was going to Nashville. Glad everybody's in the right place. But first and foremost, these are wild questions to be asking. What's your sense right now of what the White House thinks about this moment?
Well, they're furious about it, and you saw that reflected in the statements they issued this weekend after that series of reporting came out. And clearly the president is irritated by it too, because not only did he flatly reject being a Russian agent this morning, he also said that the question was absurd. Of course, the reporter only asked that question because of those series of reports over the weekend, potentially that there was a counterintelligence investigation into why the president was saying things that were beneficial to Russia. Now, that was also asked because on Saturday night, the president did an interview where he was asked outright by the host, have you worked on behalf of Russia? Are you an agent of Russia? And he didn't outright reject it. Instead, he called the question insulting and seemed to sidestep the answer. But this morning, he used no ambiguous language when he was asked that question and said, no, he is not a Russian agent. Now, Phil, something else that stood out to me in the president's comments to reporters this morning was he sought to downplay that report from the Washington Post that said he looked to conceal details of his conversation with the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, even going as far to tell the interpreter not to brief senior national security officials on what had happened because he feared that those details would leak and would get out. And it came at a time when he had been incredibly frustrated by a series of leaks coming out of his administration. Now, today he told reporters that he didn't think that was a big of a deal. He meets with leaders one-on-one all the time, even though typically most of his meetings do include some staffers, and they do typically include readouts from those meetings and what is said. But today he seemed to think that was normal. And when he was asked if he's going to release those interpreters' notes of his sit-down with Putin, he did not answer that question, Phil.
No shortage of things for Caitlin to be keeping an eye on in New Orleans, not Nashville. Caitlin, thanks very much. Keep us posted throughout the day. Here to share with their reporting and their insights, Margaret Talev of Bloomberg, Rachel Bade with Politico, Soman Kim with The Washington Post, and CNN's Shimon Prokupecz. And Shimon, I want to start with you. First, I want to play this from the president, because you can kind of guess where the posture is going to be from the president and his allies. This is what he had to say when he was asked about some of the revelations you've been reporting on. Take a listen.
The people that started that investigation are McCabe, who's a proven liar and was fired from the FBI, are Lisa Page, who was forced to leave the FBI, and her lover, Peter Strzok, who we got their text messages And what they said in those text messages was shocking when you talk about bias. And also Comey. And I guess they started it because I fired Comey, that are known scoundrels. I guess you could say they're dirty cops.
So just to break this, we know which side both sides are going to go with this and seizing on this report. But can you explain to me your read of it? You're an expert on these things. What it actually means, what we're looking at right now.
Look, I think when you look at what Baker told members of Congress, Jim Baker, that's the top FBI lawyer at the time, who winds up leaving the FBI and then is called to come into Congress and just to talk about what was going on around that time, you get the sense that there was a lot of concern by some of the people, the president there named, Lisa Page, Peter Strzok, who was running this investigation, that something was amiss, something was going on. Perhaps maybe someone got to the president, whether it was from Russia or whether there was an intermediary somewhere else, that somehow something had happened because they didn't quite understand why all of a sudden, I think, the president went in and fired the former FBI director. And so there was a lot of concern. I mean, when Baker testifies before Congress, he uses words like following directions. That was the president following the directions of the Russians? Was he doing this at the behest of the Russians? But for whatever reason, there was this concern in the FBI. There may be other information that came to them, but they didn't have enough at the time to open an investigation. Once he fired the FBI director, once he fired Comey, I think they felt they had enough there to then go ahead and open the investigation.
And you mentioned Lisa Page. One of the issues that had been brought up had been a text message that said it had been a topic of discussion for some time. And her explanation in the congressional testimony that we obtained reads as such. The case had been a topic of discussion for some time. The waiting on, which is a reference to her text message, was an indecision and a cautiousness on the part of the Bureau with respect to what to do and whether there was sufficient predication to open. And I guess, Rachel, to you, one of the questions is, this is not a minor thing. This is a major decision to make, particularly within the Bureau of Investigation. And I think there's a lot of questions of what the rationale was, if you will. And what's your read right now, particularly on Capitol Hill, as kind of how people are seeing this play out over the course of the last 48 hours?
Well, obviously the congressional committees, they've been sharing a lot of this information between each other for a while, so they weren't particularly surprised by this report. I do think that the report in the Post about the president keeping a lot of these transcripts, not allowing top White House officials to have readouts of his meetings with Russian officials, that did seem to strike some people as very new and very concerning. And, we've seen a lot of chairmen are interested in this right now. You have Jerry Nadler on the Judiciary Committee. We have Oversight Committee Chairman Elijah Cummings, who is bringing in Michael Cohen to testify in just a couple of weeks. And we're now seeing a bunch of other people jump in, including Eliot Engel, who's the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. And that story, it sounds like, has moved Engel, who's a Democrat of New York, to actually eliminate a terrorism subcommittee on that committee and create a whole new committee to look at this issue and why the president would not let officials come into the room, why he has been so secretive about his interactions with Russia, and that's going to be another key focus for them going forward.
Yeah.
One of the more charitable explanations as to why the president may have tried to obscure these notes and to limit his interpreter from talking is that, if you recall earlier on in the presidency, there were transcripts and notes of these foreign leader calls that leaked to the press. The Washington Post reported in mid-2017 about these calls with the leaders of Australia and Mexico that weren't so flattering to the president. So that could be one reason for it. But Rachel's right. There's no doubt that the House Democrats will be looking into this aggressively. You have lawyers talking about what kind of basically legal authority they have to look at these or to subpoena these records. And these senators, Democrats did try to do this last year after the Helsinki summit. There's some question as to whether you can get them or not. Obviously, I assume that the administration would probably assert some privilege over these records should they still exist in some capacity. But this is going to be a major brewing fight in the coming months for sure.
Well, and I remember being at that meeting in Germany, which was supposed to go much shorter than it ended up going. And with each passing 15-minute segment, as we were like, what are they doing in there? The kind of mounting angst by the White House staff, because of course they knew they wouldn't be able to tell us what was happening in there because they didn't know and they weren't going to know. And I think part of the concern is with this is, sure, any president wants to be able to have some discretion and keep his counsel until the White House can internally message what happened and figure out how much they want to share or not share. But when nobody knows what actually happened and what was actually promised internally, it's a real problem. And there was a lot of those concerns.
You've followed foreign policy for years now, multiple administrations. You know how these things work or how they traditionally work. Is it your sense that this was just related to the Russian president, or is this how the president operates in foreign leader meetings all the time?
I think that 2017 meeting with Putin in Germany was a special case. I do. I also think that this administration does not read out all of their foreign leader calls. In fairness, in the past, not all presidents have either. But I think there are a lot of foreign policy calls related to perhaps Syria, some of these more recent decisions in the Mideast that we don't have full visibility on right now.
Shimon, I want to close with you with our last 30 seconds. What's your sense? Obviously, we get hit with revelations and bombshells. It feels a little bit like a year ago when these were coming out. What happens next? Like, what's the next step?
Well, I think a lot of this, obviously, we're all waiting for Mueller. I think Barr today, the incoming, perhaps the next attorney general here saying that the report should be public. I think that's probably that's a good first step. Certainly that's what people want to hear. We're all just waiting on Mueller, really. And then I also think the committees in some ways are going to be held up a little bit here in terms of what they're trying to do until Mueller is done. We still don't know when that's going to definitively happen and how much of an impact Mueller will have on this entire investigation going forward. We don't know yet. But I think not until once Mueller is done, then I think that's when the Hill starts to open up a little bit.
Yeah, and all of us on the Hill will be plenty busy. By the way, Shimon, that was a great tease, because coming up next, the president's choice to be the next attorney general says Robert Mueller should finish his work.
Inside Politics is brought to you by...
Tomorrow, the president's attorney general nominee comes up to Capitol Hill for a ritual grilling. Today, William Barr is making a pair of big pre-confirmation promises regarding the Russia special counsel. In his prepared testimony, Barr says it's, quote, vitally important Robert Mueller complete his investigation, saying, I believe it is in the best interest of everyone, the president, Congress, and most importantly, the American people, that this matter be resolved by allowing the special counsel to complete his work, Barr plans to say. The country needs a credible resolution of these issues. The other important commitment, Barr says the public deserves to know what the special counsel finds. CNN's Manu Raju is on Capitol Hill. And Manu, obviously Democrats have made clear this was going to be a central issue of their questioning tomorrow. Have they reacted in any way so far to what they've seen previewed?
Well, not from these written remarks, but these are similar types of assurances that Barr was giving behind the scenes to Democratic senators last week when he was making his visits on Capitol Hill. At the time, Democrats wanted to hear much more than what he was saying. They were not satisfied at that point. Richard Blumenthal, the Senate Judiciary Committee Democrat, told me he wants ironclad, specific commitments, possibly even recusal from overseeing the Mueller investigation. Obviously, he did not go that far in these written responses or written testimony to the committee. But one thing he also tried to address was a June memo that he wrote from last year in which he raised concerns about the legality and the necessity of an investigation into obstruction of justice over the public facts surrounding the firing of James Comey. And he tries to reassure senators in his written testimony. He says this, my memo was narrow in scope, explaining my thinking on a specific obstruction of justice theory under a single statute that I thought, based on media reports, the special counsel might be considering. The memo did not address or in any way question the special counsel's core investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election, nor did it address other potential obstruction of justice theories or argue, as some have erroneously suggested, that a president can never obstruct justice. I wrote it myself on my own initiative without assistance and based solely on public information. And Phil, he also tries to reassure the committee about conversations that he had with the president, saying that he got no assurances from the president or gave anything explicitly or implicitly about how he may deal with the Mueller probe going forward. The question ultimately, though, does he win over any Democrats? And certainly, does he prevent any Republicans from voting no against his nomination? We'll see how he does tomorrow, Phil.
Yeah, must-see TV tomorrow. I think that memo is probably going to come up a little bit with committee Democrats. Joining the table now, Alana Shore with the Associated Press, also of Jeopardy fame. Look that up on YouTube. It is worth your time. I want to get into one thing specifically, and I want to read this off from the testimony, because there's two top-line points that are very clearly to reach out to Democrats to try and assuage some of the concerns. But he says, on the idea of making the Mueller report public, he says, I also believe it is very important that the public and Congress be informed of the results of the special counsel's work. For that reason, my goal will be to provide as much transparency as I can consistent with the law. That last part, the consistent with the law part, leaves a little bit of space there, I think, to some degree. Am I misreading that or overreading it?
I think it absolutely does, and that's because there's no hard and fast law governing how a potential Mueller report would get released. I mean, there are regulations out there, but he seems to be cracking the door open to not necessarily what we would expect from that, which is just a full-throated here. The public can see the report.
Right. And I guess the big question, so Manu hit on this, so you have a pulse on the committee like nobody else. Are Democrats even considering the possibility of voting for the president's nominee to oversee, that would be overseeing technically the special counsel's investigation?
I mean, Bill Barr can say whatever he wants, and we get a sense of his testimony and what he's going to say under questioning by Democrats at his confirmation hearing this week. But Democrats will focus in on the memo, and that is raising major alarms among the Democrats in the committee. And look, attorney general nominations are usually contentious anyway, regardless of the time. This is not the kind of nomination that would have gotten broad bipartisan support anyway. But the Russia element, the fact that he wrote memos, the fact that he had been publicly a bit disparaging of the Mueller investigation will give any Democrat, almost any Democrat, an easy way out. I do want to point out, though, we did learn a little bit of interesting trivia about Bill Barr and Robert Mueller last week, that they actually kind of have these personal relationships that we didn't know previously. Their wives are in Bible study together. Mueller attended Bill Barr's daughter's wedding. So I don't think he's going to, tout that too much, but that's just an interesting little fact to remember.
Yeah, there are a couple good reasons for Barr to put this out a little bit early. I mean, sure, one is to try to assure Democrats. Another is to try to take some of the steam out of Democrats' anger before they get into that room, or a line of questioning. He can say, well, I've already addressed some of this in my prepared remarks, but I'm happy to blah, 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 take another stab at it. But the third, and maybe the most important, is that he can lay a marker with President Trump by doing this. Because what he's telling the president is, I am happy to be your nominee, but these are my red lines. And don't you try to change the terms on me once I'm confirmed.
Along those lines, and very similar to those lines, he says at one point in his testimony, President Trump has sought no assurances, promises, or commitments from me of any kind, either express or implied, and I have not given him any other than I would run the department with professionalism and integrity. Will you make a promise, will you make a loyalty oath, that had been a theme particularly early on in the administration. Is it your sense right now, and again, it's early, we haven't seen the actual testimony yet, that he will be operating as an independent actor, which is the expectation for an attorney general?
I mean, I think Democrats are going to try to verify that, right? I mean, they have concerns that he's going to do exactly what Trump would want him to do, even without a request personally to, lay off something.
Is there a way he can prove to them that that's not the case?
No, of course not. I mean, you're never going to know that. He's just going to have to be testifying what he's going to be doing. And, the interesting thing for me in the House standpoint, from the House standpoint of this, is I've actually been hearing a lot of Republicans in the House say, because Barr's nomination is moving, that Democrats in the House need to let Whitaker go. As you know, Whitaker has caused a whole bunch of controversy in the House, and top House Democrats want to also bring him in and question him about, what did you talk to the president about regarding this investigation? Are you going to try to undercut or bury the Mueller investigation if it does come out on your watch? They have been stonewalling at the Justice Department because they do not want him to come in, and Republicans on the Hill also don't. So this is a whole nother angle, I guess, to watch as Barr's nomination moves forward, because Republicans want to move fast on that so that Whitaker doesn't come in, and frankly, some of them worry he might embarrass them.
That's a really good point. I don't think you're going to get Democrats to let that one go, but definitely a strategy. All right, up next, the shutdown has now dragged into, believe this, day 24. The blame game is in full swing, and a weekend snowstorm made everyone just a little bit more punchy. Just check Senator John Cornyn's tweets. Poll: snow closes what was left of U.S. government in Washington. 50% blame Trump, 20% Republicans in Congress, 20% Democrats in Congress, the rest unsure. We'll be right back. It's now day 24 of the partial government shutdown, and it's beginning to feel a lot like Groundhog Day. Frankly, it has the last 23 days. The dynamics, they have not changed. Neither side has budged, and both are eager to blame the opposite side. Just see the president's morning tweets for proof. Nancy and Crying Chuck can end the shutdown in 15 minutes at this point. It has become their and the Democrats' fault. President Trump tells reporters those furloughed and unpaid workers agree with it.
We have a very big crisis, a humanitarian crisis on the border. Everybody knows it. They know it. And many of them are saying, we agree with you. Many of them are calling and many of them are breaking. The Republicans are rock solid. We've got to take care of our border. Many of the people, they're all going to get their money. Many of the people that aren't being paid right now are in total agreement with us.
But even after all the tweets, the Democratic press conferences on Capitol Hill, and an extensive White House public relations blitz, a new CNN poll shows that neither the president nor the Democrats have really moved the needle on the need for a border wall. 81% of Republicans say they're in favor of a wall. That is exactly the same number as last month before the shutdown began. Among independents and Democrats, a very small number have changed their minds. Okay, so how many ways can you say impasse without profanity? Here's an interesting thing. One of the biggest things, and I think we're all kind of connoisseurs of fiscal crises and shutdown crises. We've all been through a lot of them. And there's always kind of the, all right, what's the way out here? And usually you can kind of map out in your head, like eventually this, and this are going to happen, and then this is going to happen, and we're going to get out of this. Listen to what the president said about some of the options that may have been put on the table earlier today.
Well, that was a suggestion that Lindsey made, but I did reject it, yes. I'm not interested. I want to get it solved. I don't want to just delay it. I'm not looking to call a national emergency. This is so simple, you shouldn't have to. Now, I have the absolute legal right to call it, but I'm not looking to do that because this is too simple. This should be the easiest deal that I've ever seen. We're talking about border security. Who can be against it?
Deal not so breezy so far. What he was referring to with Lindsey Graham was Lindsey Graham over the weekend pitched the idea that's actually been pitched by multiple people over the course of the last couple of weeks, which is reopen the government in the near term, put a deadline on it, have the deadline kind of serve as an anvil over people's heads, and then reopen the government. Also rejecting a national emergency, which as of like Thursday of last week, everybody on the Hill was certain that was the direction he was going. Okay, how does this end?
The question on everybody's lips, right? I mean, maybe it's the Senate nerd in me that thinks that this may end if more Senate Republicans feel the heat, pressure Mitch McConnell, hey, like maybe we should have a stopgap, maybe we should budge a little bit. That's not happening right now, though. We have some skepticism, some concern from corners of the GOP conference, but not really enough to push McConnell in that direction. So that's one way we could get out of this that has been sort of closed for now. I mean, we'll see. Short of that, Democrats budging, but it's hard to see that happening right now. I mean, they feel like they have the upper hand.
Yeah, and going to that argument about Senate Republicans cracking and pressuring Mitch McConnell, because that's something that Chuck Schumer has talked about for a while. The magic number here in that point would be 67, which would be the number necessary to override a presidential veto in the Senate. I was walking through this with some Republican sources last week, and look, the first tier of Republicans who might crack are pretty easy to figure out. You know, Cory Gardner has a tough re-election challenge. You have the institutionalists who hate shutdowns like Lamar Alexander and Susan Collins, you know, throw in a couple of retiring folks like Pat Roberts and whatnot. That gets you to like mid-50s. What's that next tier? Who's going to crack in that more conservative next tier of Senate Republicans? A lot of them who will be watching for primary challenges in 2020. I don't see how you get there at this point, and that explains the impasse or whatever you want to call it right now.
But this is why we are hearing from White House officials and top Republicans on the Hill that even though the president went out today and said, I'm not doing an emergency declaration right now, that is not off the table. It's very much on the table, and they're staying now. It's a last resort. And in the meantime, the White House has been talking about trying to go around Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and bring in a bunch of blue dogs, moderate House Democrats from the House to try to say, hey, what do you think about a DACA deal for Dreamers for some wall money? But you're right. The president just a couple days ago panned that idea and said he wanted to do the national emergency. Now things apparently have flipped, and he is open to a bipartisan something at this moment and doesn't want to do the emergency. How do you negotiate with a president who changes his mind every day? Democrats don't want to do it, and you can't blame them for that. So I don't know how we're going to get out of this.
Yeah, it's an issue kind of underpinning all of this, right? Is nobody knows where the president necessarily is, and so it's tough to. I think Schumer called him trying to nail Jell-O to a wall at one point, and that's not exclusive to Democrats. Republicans on the Hill feel the same way too. They're not totally sure which way this is going to go. You brought up an interesting point. There are people on the Republican side who believe that Democrats may be cracking, particularly some of the freshmen who came here to do something, and preferably not this. Is there any sense in your mind that that might be a way out of it? I haven't seen it, but you're a better reporter than I am.
Oh, yeah, I'll go on. I think it's wishful thinking right now, but I do think from the president's language, and you could see it outside of at the Marine One departure this morning, you can hear it in his language that he's saying, well, now the Democrats, he is trying to build this sort of narrative of transition in the hopes that if this goes on long enough, he can remessage this to convince people that the Democrats created the shutdown. And I do think it's important for everyone to remember that the only reason that the border wall and the shutdown are co-linked intractably is because President Trump co-linked them. So I think right now the Democrats see there's no upside in making the first offer here because they don't think they need to make an offer anyhow. But I think that part of what we're waiting for is the president to test the idea of whether he can remessage this. If he can't, if the numbers don't change and the public continues by a large majority to either completely blame him or partly blame him, then he has a bigger problem than he has right now.
Yeah. Just a reminder, there are staff on both sides of the aisle in both chambers that could get them out of this like that. They just need the green light to do it. All right, up next, the harshest of harsh words by a member of Congress against the president. His response, who cares? Topping our political radar, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo heading home from the Middle East early for a family funeral after making multiple stops, including Saudi Arabia, where he met with King Salman and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Pompeo says he told them those responsible for killing journalist Jamal Khashoggi must be held accountable. The Secretary of State says the Saudi leaders reiterated their commitment to ensuring that happens. And a federal court in California putting the brakes on a Trump administration policy concerning Obamacare, just one day before it goes into effect. The presiding judge said Sunday the administration's weakening of the contraceptive mandate could have, quote, dire public health consequences. Now, the new rules would allow more employers to get exemptions. The court's injunction only applies to the 13 states that sued and the District of Columbia. The Supreme Court sidestepping a challenge to Matt Whitaker's appointment as acting attorney general. Critics concerned he could fire the special counsel say the president's choice of Whitaker violates federal law. But in an unusual move, the High Court rejected that argument by means of a firearms case that sought to have Whitaker's name removed as one of the parties. Other challenges are still pending, however. And President Trump this morning brushing off reporters' questions about a new member of Congress who says he's a racist on national television. Here's the brief exchange outside the White House.
Who did? Who cares?
Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez firing back on Twitter saying, quote, I bartended for years in New York City. I understand guys like this like the back of my hand. We get under their skin, end quote. And up next, President Trump brings back a familiar nickname for one of his possible 2020 opponents, this time in a racially insensitive tweet. President Trump says he's not worried when it comes to Democrats' growing 2020 field, but that didn't stop him from going after Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren, who's exploring a possible White House bid. In a pair of tweets last night, the president mocked Warren for drinking a beer live on Instagram, saying, quote, if Elizabeth Warren, often referred to by me as Pocahontas, did this commercial from Bighorn or Wounded Knee instead of her kitchen, with her husband dressed in full Indian garb, it would have been a smash. Trump also called the social media move a catastrophe. Now, Warren isn't the only candidate catching the president's attention. He also had this to say about potential 2020 opponents, including former Vice President Joe Biden.
Well, I don't want to pick anyone out, but, a lot of people say Biden's doing okay, but, he was always a 1%er. He was a 1% guy. He ran 2 or 3 times. He never got above 1%. And then Obama came along and took him off the trash heap. Then he became a vice president, and now he's probably leading. But he's basically a 1% guy. He's weak.
Already. Not very subtle. Look, I kind of want to put the tweets aside, to be frank, other than if it forces people to read about Wounded Knee, great, because you should. It was a horrifying time in history, and people should learn more about it. But more broadly, and this is something we were talking about during the break, so I hope you guys sharpened your messages for the best points in this. But this is something the Democratic field is going to have to contend with. How do you respond to this? Because it's coming in spades, and you're covering them right now. What's your sense right now of where people think they should go?
My sense, especially when it comes to Warren, but this is true for all candidates, is people are wary of trying to beat Trump at his own game. And by his own game, I mean some of these occasionally very insensitive and politically incorrect things he'll say. Elizabeth Warren tried to get out and beat him at the game, undercutting the terrible Pocahontas nickname with her DNA test rollout. And we saw how that played. It just played as very tone deaf. So now it's interesting to see Warren. She didn't respond to that tweet, and I don't think we can expect her to respond to that tweet. When she traveled to Iowa for the first time, she conspicuously didn't really make it about Trump. She made it about her own policy. So it feels like she's kind of learning that lesson, and other candidates, I think, will follow.
So along those lines, Julian Castro, who announced officially he's running for president this weekend, kind of weighed in on this a little bit. Take a listen to what he had to say.
I see myself as the antidote to Trump. My story is an immigrant story. It's a testament to what immigrants have contributed to this country. I'm convinced that we're not going to beat Donald Trump by trying to be Donald Trump. What people want is they want a strong, positive vision for the future of their country and how it's going to impact them and their family. And that's what I laid out today. But that doesn't mean you don't stand up to him or point out policies that are bad policies.
I think in theory that's the dream, right? That you can pick and choose your moments, don't have to respond to everything, and mainly focus it on policy. Is that a reality?
Yeah, I mean, I think Democrats are going to try to do that. I think they learned a valuable lesson in this past midterm cycle, and that was that House Democrats didn't focus a lot on Trump. They let the media sort of do the covering about all the scandal and controversy coming out of the White House. And when they were doing ads in their districts, they were focused on things like healthcare, pocketbook issues, and that was a strategy that they developed 2 years ago. And Nancy Pelosi and people who were sort of governing the communication strategy, including Hakeem Jeffries, who is now leading their communications arm, they were adamant about sticking to that message, and it really worked for them. So I think that Democrats who are running in 2020 are obviously looking at what House Democrats did successfully to pick up 40 seats this fall, and going to try to continue to do that. Now, can they withstand Trump goading them and not hit back? TBD on that.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, it's been a while since we've heard things from Democratic leaders saying, when they go low, we kick them, or we go lower. I mean, they've tried to project a little bit more of a positive message that doesn't necessitate requiring or responding to Trump at every turn. And I'm really interested in seeing how the rest of the 2020 feel, first of all, how many there are, but what their respective approaches are to Trump. Because as we were talking about earlier, there isn't anyone yet that has made kind of their brand as fighting Trump, except for Michael Avenatti, who we know is long out of the race. So it'd be interesting to see if there is another candidate among the 57 who run that does take that more confrontational approach.
But so I don't do media criticism, but let me do it for 2 seconds here.
You do media.
But if there's a 30-person field and everyone's trying to break through with a message, is talking about longevity for Social Security payouts going to get it done, or how do you break through? And I think that's going to be part of the equation. And also, there are times when you have to respond to a president's attack on you, and a candidate's ability to focus on their own message when they want to, but to instinctively hit back the right way without making it sound like it's talking points that you practice like 25 times with your consultant and don't really feel comfortable about doing off the cuff is going to be another challenge. So I think it's like, here's the perfect candidate, right? Whoever that is someone who knows how to do it all.
Good news.
Stay on message when you want to stay on message, hit back naturally and in an effective way, and figure out how to break through in a crowded field. That sounds so simple.
Yeah, the good news is we're going to have like 966 candidates to write to, all sorts of different theories. There were like 300 things I wanted to get here on this one, but this was great. So apologies. We'll get to more. This show goes every single day of the week. All right, up next, the president says he's not aware of a Congressman Steve King's inflammatory comments. We'll catch him up next.
Who? I haven't been following it. I really haven't been following it.
And if you look at your screen right now, President Trump is walking into the Beast, as his presidential limousine is known. He's arrived in Kenner, Louisiana. He will in short order be heading to New Orleans, where he will be speaking at a farmers event. These are big public comments. I'm sure we'll have more from that later in the show. Actually, next show, I think. We've only got about 5 minutes left. And in those 5 minutes, let's address something that's actually rather important. Steve King How about you go ahead and call your office? The Iowa Republican congressman, who has a history of making racial, inflammatory, and controversial remarks, has been summoned to an important meeting with House GOP leader Kevin McCarthy today, following his remarks to the New York Times in which he questioned, quote, white nationalist, white supremacist, Western civilization. How did that language become offensive? Those comments continued to be rebuked by just about everyone over the weekend, but many want action. Now, McCarthy says his meeting with the 9-term congressman will be about just that.
That language has no place in America. That is not the America I know, and it's most definitely not the party of Lincoln.
Should he be punished for it?
I have a scheduled meeting with him on Monday, and I will tell you this. I've watched on the other side that they do not take action when their members say something like this. Action will be taken. I'm having a serious conversation with Congressman Steve King on his future and role in this Republican Party. I will not stand back as a leader of this party, believing in this nation that all are created equal, that stands or continues to stand and have any role with us.
So let's go ahead and lay out what some of the options could be as you see the president right now. It looks like he's walking over to greet some of the people who are waiting for him at the airport. But I want to talk about this because this is important. There are things that Congress can do. You can take him off committees. If you look over the course of history, there's reprimands used about 10 members of history of Congress, censure used about 23 times in Congress, expulsion another option. Look, this is not new for Congressman Steve King. Anybody who's been covering Capitol Hill for any number of years knows that this is actually a fairly regular occurrence. You know the House Republicans better than anybody. Is something actually going to happen or change this time?
I mean, TBD at this point. We can say that the reaction from McCarthy is definitely stronger than what we've seen him do before. Just a couple weeks before the election, King was saying additional racist comments, and we saw the leader of the House Republican campaign arm, Steve Stivers, push back on him and rebuke him on Twitter. And Stivers actually, some top Republicans were not happy with him for doing that right before a midterm election. And now we're seeing these comments again, and King, again, has a long history of making these sorts of remarks, and McCarthy is reacting. I understand that he is not going to be asked to step down in this meeting with McCarthy, but there are a number of options depending on how he reacts. And does he come out and apologize? And, one of the things Democrats talking about censure, some Republicans would like to see that move forward, but I don't know if McCarthy himself would support something like that. I'm just not sure at this point.
And I want to draw attention to something. There's a National Review editorial on this where it says, quote, it'd be better if Republicans police their own, and the NRCC made clear it won't back King in a primary or a general election in 2020. King may be clumsy, dangerous, bigoted, or some mix of the three. Whatever he is, he doesn't deserve the support of conservatives. He now has a primary challenger. People have been talking, I think Jeb Bush was talking about perhaps donating to his primary challenger. Does that become the outlet here, and is that enough?
Well, it's unclear right now whether the party leadership will begin supporting his challenger. Like, typically, Republican campaign arms have a tradition of supporting incumbents, and that policy, that general tradition, is really going to be put to the test now that Steve King does have a primary challenger that's condemning the congressman's rhetoric. It's a question we'll be asking the chairman, Tom Emmer, in the coming days. But again, I do want to emphasize that his comments, as reprehensible as they are nothing new. But it's just this pushback coming back so fiercely from the Republican Party that has been remarkable to watch. We talked about Leader McCarthy's comments. You talked about Joni Ernst, who is Congressman King's senator, saying these comments are racist, that they do not represent the state of Iowa. And again, Tim Scott, the only African-American senator, Republican senator, writing a very forceful opinion piece condemning those remarks.
Yeah, Senator Scott's op-ed, I think, seemed to open the floodgates. People taking a posture on this that perhaps they hadn't taken any of the dozen or so times we've seen something like this before. All right, that's all the time we have. Great panel, as always. Thanks for joining us on Inside Politics. Brianna Keilar starts right now.